Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you all for being here. It is a beautiful day outside, so the fact that you guys have taken time to join us is very appreciated by all of us here at the McDonnell Academy and WashU with the Cabot-Zhang lecture. Like I said, it's just one of those lovely days out, and I'm so pleased that you're here inside for a few minutes to join us. I'd like to introduce Dr. Vijay Ramani, who is the I'm just going to make up a new title for you. Who is the Vice Provost for Graduate Education and International Affairs, as well as the Executive Director of the McDonnell Academy. And he is going to introduce our featured speaker, as well as our faculty member, Guillermo, who are going to talk to us today about China and its relationship with the U.S. So, Vijay.
Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this lectureship. Laura mentioned something about an executive director. The role consists of standing in front of you at these kind of events and saying a few words. So that's what I do as executive director. The real work is done by Laura and her team, who put all of this together, identified the speaker, made sure all the logistics were straightened out, etc. So thank you, Laura, and thanks to everybody who worked with you to make this happen. I'll share a little bit about the lectureship itself. So this is called, it's sort of summarized as the Cabot-Zhang Endowed Lectureship. And this was made possible thanks to a gift from the Cabot Corporation, which is a specialty chemicals manufacturer based out of Boston, if I'm not mistaken. And as somebody who's an electrochemist who's worked with electrochemical related materials for a long time, Cabot Corporation, of course, is very familiar to me because they make carbons and they make functionalized carbons. And that's what we use in our research a lot. So I've known about Cabot Corporation for a very, very, very long time. And the Zhang comes from Xinsheng Zhang, who was a senior executive at Cabot. Then also after that went on to be the leader of Shell in China and a very senior member of the Shell board. And so this lectureship was instituted by the Cabot Corporation in honor of Xinsheng Zhang, who was a distinguished polymer scientist in his own right and a top corporate leader. We've had a number of distinguished speakers, and today we are proud to welcome another very distinguished guest, Ali Wyne. And Ali is a senior research and advocacy advisor for U.S.-China relationships at the International Crisis Group. He has a very distinguished record. He's previously worked at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Bifer Center for Science and International Affairs, U.S. State Department, the RAND Corporation, and many other entities. He has authored a number of very authoritative books and monographs. I'm just going to mention one, and that is Lee Kuan Yew, the Grandmaster's Insights on China, the United States, and the World. Now, I'll mention that because, we talk about statesmanship a lot, and some may argue it's in short supply these days, but Lee Kuan Yew, who was the first prime minister of Singapore, was a true statesman. He took Singapore from what was a very, I would definitely say a struggling nation state, fledgling nation state coming out of World War II, no running water, no sanitation facilities to speak of. It was actually manual scavenging, without getting too graphic, which is basically Singapore he took over and transformed it over a period of 3 decades into perhaps the best run country that I have ever been to. Everything in Singapore works. You get into Singapore, you just know things are going to work. You don't worry about anything, right? And it's testament to Lee Kuan Yew, of course, on the topic of today's talk, that when he passed away, of course, this outpouring of grief, but no monument. And when I asked some people in Singapore why, they said, just look around you, that's the monument. Today's Singapore is the monument to Lee Kuan Yew. So anyway, just a little anecdote, but one of his books was on Lee Kuan Yew, who in my view has been one of the greatest statesmen of the past 100 years for positive change. Been a lot of people who've done a lot of nonsense, and they've also been impactful, but positive impact, right? So today, the topic in the tradition of the Cabot-Zhang lectureship is on the broad issue of U.S.-China relationships. Now, I know there's a variety of perspectives on this, And therefore, our expert, Ali, will talk to us about it. And Guillermo Rosas, who's a professor in political science at WashU and is also a faculty fellow in the Office of the Provost, will help moderate after some remarks by Ali. So Ali, please welcome to WashU, and I'd like to invite you to come up and we can begin.
I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you, Vice Provost Ramani. Thank you so much for having me. I had been in St. Louis before, not recently, but this is my first time to campus, and I hope and trust that it won't be my last. I've met a number of you over the course of the past 2 days, and there's something in the water here. Just the student body is incredible. The campus is incredible. The McDonnell Academy is, I think, one of the superlative initiatives that I've encountered in higher education. I've met a number of you who are part of that illustrious program, and really it's a testament to all of you here. So Guillermo, thank you very much for moderating this, and Vice Provost Ramani, thank you. I do want to thank a few other individuals just before diving into some remarks, and then really just looking forward to a conversation. Laura, thank you so much. Angie, I know is somewhere out here. If I see Ruby. There's Ruby right there. So just a brief anecdote about Ruby Tucson, who's sitting in the third row. Ruby and I have been friends for, I think, 12 years now. So we briefly overlapped at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. And earlier this year in March, Ruby brought a select number of McDonnell International Academy scholars to Washington, very kindly invited me to meet with them. And so it was there that I learned about the program. I got to reconnect with Ruby, and it was there I got to meet Laura Benoit and Angie Rahman, who were so gracious to invite me to come and spend the afternoon with you. So delighted to be here. Now, as I think as some of you who have spoken, some of you with whom I've spoken over the past couple of days will know, if I get animated about a subject, I certainly don't have a shortage of things to say. I can go on for a while, but I'm going to try and restrain myself. I'm going to try to be brief. Well, I want to talk about, I shouldn't even say talk about, I want to present a hypothesis for your consideration. That's really, so the provisional title of my presentation is, essentially, is there a U.S. consensus on China policy? And I want to make the case that that notion of a U.S. consensus on China policy is in fact a misguided narrative. And so I'm going to offer some reasons why I think it's a misguided narrative, and then I want to test out that hypothesis with all of you. So I mean, all of you have heard this proposition, I'm sure, that there is a U.S. consensus on China policy. I live in Washington, I work in Washington, and that statement or that insistence that there's a consensus, it's by now almost an axiom. But not only in Washington, I would say in capitals around the world, you hear that there's a U.S. consensus on China policy. And at first blush, it seems to be an abundantly justified argument. China has the world's second largest economy. It has the world's second largest defense budget. It's the world's leading exporter. It has the largest number of diplomatic posts, more so, I recently discovered, even than the United States. It's the leading center of global innovation. And we can go on and on and on. And we're seeing also evidence in recent years that China, as it's becoming more confident and coming into its own on the international stage, it's increasingly not just being content occupying a place within the current international system. It's increasingly sketching the outlines of its own alternative vision. So China now is much more confident, much more capable, and really the only country that could be considered a peer competitor or near peer competitor to the United States. But once you move beyond that judgment in the United States, once you move beyond the judgment that China is America's most potent strategic competitor, this alleged consensus, at least to my thinking, begins to disintegrate very quickly. Ryan Haas of the Brookings Institution and myself, the two of us, we wrote an article a few months ago, posted on the Brookings Institution's website, in which we really did a deep dive and tried to interrogate this presumption that a consensus exists. And we go into a lot more detail in the article, but I want to surface, for the purposes of our conversation this afternoon, three really fundamental questions about which there are still very vigorous debates. Three fundamental questions that make me think that this notion of a consensus is overstated. One of them is a historical question, one of them is an analytical question, and one of them is a prescriptive question. So first, the historical question. There's a very prevalent narrative, especially in Washington, and I'm going to come back to saying Washington because I think that this strain of thinking is especially acute in Washington. You encounter this narrative a lot that America got China wrong. You'll hear this narrative a lot that if, had it not been for American naivete, had it not been for American largesse, that China wouldn't be in the position that it is today. So there's this narrative that we got China wrong by trying to integrate it into the international system after World War II, and the United States naively enabled the resurgence of what is now its principal competitor. So there's this narrative that America got China wrong. But there's a debate. There's a debate about whether or not America got China wrong. And I would submit that that narrative that one often hears is misguided. So let's say hypothetically, and if we put on our counterfactual hats, let's say hypothetically that instead of trying to bring China into the international system, let's say instead, as some have advocated that we should have done, that the United States said we were going to contain China. Maybe we could have slowed China down. We probably could have slowed down China a lot. But I think we would have earned very little, if any, support from US allies and partners. And I think perhaps most importantly, we would have almost guaranteed that when, not if, when China came out from under US pressure, it would be not a complex competitor with some investment in the international system, but a really determined adversary with a determination to dismantle that system. And I think that that China would have been far more dangerous to the United States, far more dangerous to the international system. So China today is a complex competitor, certainly, but it's not the determined adversary that I think we might have produced had we opted to contain China. So other people will say, well, okay, maybe we shouldn't have done containment, but maybe we shouldn't have been so supportive of China's emergence out of pariah status. We should have been passive. We should have been agnostic. And my response to that claim would be, well, if the United States had been a passive bystander and hadn't put in the work to bring China into the fold, we wouldn't have the kinds of deep connections that exist today between the two countries, economic interdependence, very robust dialogues between government officials, informal dialogues outside of government channels, cultural exchanges, educational exchanges, and those connections, political connections, economic connections, cultural connections, those connections serve as very important guardrails that prevent intensifying competition from turning into unchecked escalation. And so there's a historical debate. Did we get China wrong? I think that narrative is misguided, but there's a debate to be had. Then there's an analytical question. Is China still rising or is it peaking? There's a narrative that you hear sometimes about peak China that says that on account of demographic decline, slowing economic growth, and a whole host of other challenges, that China either has peaked or will soon peak. Now, depending on, given China's complexities, China is a country of 1.4 billion people, and given China's scale, given China's complexities, given China's contradictions, depending on which data points you stitch together, depending on which evidence you adduce, you can pretty much come up for support for any one of three hypotheses. Either that China is kind of gliding along to global dominance. There's some who subscribe to that hypothesis. Hypothesis two, that China maybe is about to peak, or, and this is where I tend to come down, that there's somewhere in the middle is closer to the truth, that China is neither gliding towards global dominance nor staring down terminal decline, but that instead I think that China is likely to be a constrained competitor, but an enduring competitor. So for those who worry that China is headed towards global dominance, they cite China, the size of China's economy, they cite China's military modernization, they cite China's technological advances. For those who say that China is peaking, they cite demographic decline, slowing growth, the number of alliances and partnerships that exist in Asia that are pushing back against China militarily. And then for folks such as myself, we say, well, both of those hypotheses contain elements of truth. And so my own view is that, again, China, it's not peaking, it's not peaking, it's not going to dominate, but somewhere in the middle. So there's a second question, which is what is China's trajectory? And then the third question, over which I think there's a tremendous amount of debate, and I think arguably the most fundamental question is a prescriptive one, and that is, what should American policy be towards China? And a really vigorous debate has just erupted in recent months between those who say that this is a zero-sum competition that the United States must win, versus those who say, well, this is not really a new Cold War. China is very different than the Soviet Union. And so this is not a competition to be won. This is a relationship to be managed. There's a very vigorous debate in Washington between sort of the winners camp and the managers camp. And so that's a very brief rundown. I promise I did actually prepare, and Rumi and Lauren Angie can attest to this. I did prepare remarks, and those will be posted hopefully in a few days on the International Crisis Group's website. But I didn't come all this way to read to you. I wanted to just kind of ad lib a little bit and have a conversation. But you look at that historical debate, the analytical debate, the prescriptive debate, and I think if you consider those questions, my takeaway is not only is there not a consensus, but on some of the most first-order fundamental questions of China policy, they're very vigorous, outstanding debates. And so that's really the hypothesis that I want to test with all of you this afternoon, is whether you think there is a consensus on China policy. If so, what are its pillars? I want to push back against that notion. And I'll just maybe say a few words in closing, because I really, I want to have a conversation with Guillermo and with all of you. Some folks might say, well, why should we dwell on these debates? Why should we dwell on disagreements over history, over China's trajectory, over prescription? And I would argue that these are not idle academic exercises. I think that they have very profound implications for policy. If you don't know where you're going, if the United States doesn't have greater clarity about what it's trying to accomplish in the relationship, then there's a real risk that competition turns from a means to an end into an end unto itself. And I think that that's a real risk when you're conducting foreign policy, that you treat competition as an end unto itself rather than as a means. And so I really just before closing, I think that there is a very open debate around China policy. There's a very vigorous debate on a number of fundamental questions. And I think that rather than insisting that there is a consensus when I would argue that one doesn't exist, I think that we should be having a more vigorous debate, a more thorough debate. And just in closing, I'll make one final note. Obviously, the U.S.-China relationship is strained. I'm not sanguine. I don't labor under any illusions. The U.S.-China relationship, it is competitive. It is strained. I think that there's good reason to believe that regardless of what happens in America's presidential election, hard to believe, taking place in less than a month, but regardless of what happens in November, I think that come January of 2025, the relationship is still going to be strained, will continue to get more strained. So that's true. But I think that it's very important for all of us, and I think that each of us in this room today has a role to play in this regard. I think it's very important that we resist the fatalistic thinking that has taken hold in certain quarters, which says that structural forces condemn the United States and China to permanent enmity. And I hear this argument a lot, that there are these big, almost abstract, invisible structural forces propelling the United States and China towards ever greater confrontation. And I guess my humble rebuttal to that argument is, and if there's only one point that you take away from anything that I say this afternoon, it would be this. Yes, structural forces exist. Of course they exist. And I think that they loom especially large between the United States and China, given that the United States believes it's exceptional in the annals of human history. China believes that it's exceptional in the annals of human history. They both have competing pretensions to exceptionalism. And so I think especially for the United States and China, those structural forces loom very large. But my rejoinder, my humble rejoinder for all of your consideration this afternoon is that those structural forces exist, but they exist alongside, and I would like to believe that they are subordinate to human agency. And I think that the charge for all of us is to remember and to remind ourselves that agency in the past has prevailed over structure, and we have to ensure, given the stakes of what's riding on getting the U.S.-China relationship right, I think we all must remember that agency can and must prevail over structure for these two great powers to coexist. So with that, why don't I stop there, and thank you for inviting me, and looking forward to a conversation. Yeah.
Ali, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you for accepting our invitation. We're going to have an opportunity to get questions from the audience, but we thought that it would be profitable to get started with a bit of a conversation. I actually had an opportunity, I was telling you before, Ali, to read not your Lee Kuan Yew book, but the one that you published a couple of years ago, America's Great Power Opportunity, right? And I recognize some of the topics in your remarks just now from what I read in the book. And I think it's particularly a good idea to go back to your distinction between historical, analytical, and perhaps prescriptive questions, right? So let me follow that kind of pattern. You just mentioned a moment ago that some of the debates that we have when we think about great power rivalry, right, might strike us as academic, as Byzantine, as having no sort of impact in how we actually make decisions that eventually have consequences. So at the risk of waxing a little bit too academic, let me, I don't practice any of this now, but I was once a student of the history of international relations. And one thing that I found very interesting in your book, and now in your approach as well, is that, I recall learning that the world works differently this is a Walesian hypothesis, if you will, depending on the structure of competition among great powers, right? So we move from a multipolar world in the 19th century, perhaps all the way through World War II, to a bipolar world following World War II, that led, of course, to the strategic interaction between the Soviet Union and the United States. And then later on, with the fall of communism in the Soviet Union, we end up in a unipolar world. And one thing that I wanted to get your thoughts on, and we don't have to dwell too long on this if you don't want to, but I just don't know what to make of the current moment, right? It doesn't seem to be quite a bipolar moment, but it's also clear that multipolarity is not here yet. And I wonder if this is part of the difficulty in arriving at a consensus or in misinterpreting a consensus view that the United States and China are structurally forced to be rivals.
Thank you for the question. So many thoughts. I'll try to be brief, but a number of thoughts. Well, first, I appreciate your mentioning history because not only is history not divorced from policy, if you misinterpret history, and it's the reason why I'm very skeptical of the notion. Not just skeptical, I'm quite nervous about the frequency with which this notion of a new Cold War is invoked. If you misinterpret history, you're going to misinterpret, or you're going to err, I think, in making policy going forward. I think that one of the reasons that this notion of a new Cold War has so much traction is it makes policymakers feel that they can revisit a familiar playbook. And so when you utter the phrase new Cold War, you immediately think of the first Cold War. What was the outcome of the first Cold War? The outcome of the first Cold War was the Soviet Union disintegrated, the United States and maybe the West more broadly prevailed. And if you're sitting in Washington, that outcome is very comforting. And so when you draw on that example, by framing the US-China relationship as a new Cold War, I think it makes policymakers feel that perhaps, we won the first Cold War, maybe we can do so again, we have a familiar script. But the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, there are some superficial similarities, certainly, between the US-Soviet competition or rivalry and the relationship between the United States and China today. But I think that the more you scrutinize the analogy, the more that it unravels. So just to articulate a few of the differences, China is vastly more economically capable than the Soviet Union ever was. The United States and China are far more economically interdependent than the United States and the Soviet Union ever were. I think that one of the very interesting differences between the two cases is the United States and the Soviet Union, they made a conscious decision, a mutual decision at the outset of the Cold War that they didn't want to become economically interdependent. The United States was fearful that economic interdependence would allow the Soviet Union to engage in ideological subversion of NATO. Moscow was concerned that economic interdependence would allow the United States to infiltrate ideologically into the Warsaw Pact. And so they made a conscious decision that we want to separate economically, or we don't want to couple economically. The United States and China, in some ways, are engaged in almost sort of the converse, and that is, you have two major powers. They don't really have an organic basis for cultivating their relationship, and so they kind of say, look, let's make common cause against the Soviet Union. Let's build up our economic ties, and maybe economic interdependence, in the absence of organic trust, maybe economic interdependence will allow us to build a functional relationship. And the US-China rivalry is really beginning in earnest at a time when they are tremendously economically integrated. So it's a very, very fundamental difference. There's one other difference that I would articulate, and then I want to get to the point about is it a bipolar world, a multipolar world? Another fundamental difference is, I think that today's so-called, whether you call them middle powers or swing states or pivot states, I mean, there's a significant sort of vocabulary to describe sort of essentially countries that are not named either the United States or China, a very, very large number of countries. We often hear, for good reason, that during the Cold War, there were a number of non-aligned countries. Today, I really like the formulation from India's Foreign Minister Jaishankar, and he says, he's often asked, what is describe India's foreign policy orientation. He says, India is a non-aligned, as it was during the Cold War. He says India is multi-aligned. And I remember the first time I heard that phrase, I said, oh, non-aligned, multi-aligned. Okay, you just change the prefix, non-aligned, multi-aligned. What is the difference? It's actually a very profound difference. And he explained, because I think he rightly expected that a lot of people would react the way that I did. And what is the difference? Multi-alignment is much more proactive. If you're non-aligned, you're you keep your head down, you're passive, you don't want to upset the United States, you don't want to upset the Soviet Union. If you're multi-aligned, you say, look, I'm going to take charge of my foreign policy. I'm going to take charge of my relationships. And so in certain instances, depending on the issue, depending on the circumstance, I'll align with the United States. Depending on the circumstance, depending on the issue, I will align with Russia, or I'll align with China. But multi-alignment is much more proactive. And I think that today's middle of power, swing states, pivot states, they not only feel much more empowered than non-aligned countries did during the Cold War, they also increasingly sense we don't have to choose either the United States or China. In some cases, we can play the United States and China off of one another. In some cases, we can also benefit from investment from both countries. So I think we see this dynamic playing out, I think, perhaps most notably in the developing world. And here again, there's this growing lexicon, global South, global majority, again, the developing world, pick your term. But I think what we see in a number of countries, whether it's in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, a number of countries are saying, well, look, if the United States and China, if they're at loggerheads, we can actually leverage their rivalry to our advantage. If we need investment, if we need trade, if we need infrastructure, if America comes to us and says and gives us an offer, great. If China comes to us and gives us an offer, great. So I think that, let me just close by saying I'm really glad that you kind of took our conversation away from just the US-China bilateral lens and expanded the conversation, because the direction of the US-China rivalry is not going to depend only on decisions made in Washington and Beijing. It's going to depend on decisions made in a number of other capitals around the world. And so I think it's very important for practitioners, scholars in both capitals to pay attention to what countries outside of that bilateral confines, what they have to say.
So I heard you say that we really are closer to a multipolar world. Maybe I'm misinterpreting, but let me actually move in a different direction, because I think it's a very astute point that when you're making about the misuses of historical analogies, right? And there's a big risk here, as you suggest. Even if we convince ourselves somehow that we live again in a bipolar world, it is certainly completely different.
Yeah.
The extent of economic interdependence between these two competitors is much larger than the one that existed before. And that's always a risk with these structural explanations.
Yeah.
You also made a point about agency. And here I cannot help but agree with you 100% about how important it is to think very carefully, moving on to analytical questions brought by your talk and your book, how important it is to have a really clear set of ideas about how these two great powers, China and the United States, read each other, right? So when we say agency, we say preferences, we say beliefs. And one of the most important beliefs that we have as agents is that we end up forming theories about how the other, the adversary thinks about the strategic interaction which we are set. One thing that strikes me, you don't mention this much, right? But one very clear difference between China and the United States is its regime form. And I wonder if you can give us a sense of how this matters when it comes to figuring out what the counterpart is thinking, figuring out what the counterpart preferences and logics are.
Yeah.
The fact that China has a, I'm not going to use words like democracy but a closed system or regime form, as opposed to the United States that has a more open regime form. How does that factor in how we think about Chinese foreign policy? How does that factor in China about how they think about American foreign policy?
Yeah. No, thank you. It's, this is a question that I grapple with, on a daily basis. I guess, in theory, well, it raises opportunities and also, I think, difficulties for both sides. So if you're an interlocutor in China, and if you observe, the debate in the United States, it's very raucous. There are lots of parties. So you have folks, you have folks in government, you have folks on Capitol Hill, you have folks in the think tank community, you have folks in civil, elsewhere in civil society, you have folks on various social media platforms. And so when the debate is very raucous, kind of sussing out kind of which voices are ascending, which voices are maybe descending in influence. I think also sort of sussing out to what extent certain statements are made because it's election season, as we're in right now. Sussing out, and so here's actually a good example. During election season, there's almost a political obligation, especially if you're running for re-election. So whether you're running for the presidency, whether you're running for Congress, there's almost your candidates are sort of trying to outdo each other, sort of who can sound tougher on China. So something that I think now that context is important, because sometimes if if a Chinese interlocutor isn't maybe as sensitized to the extent to which sort of election dynamics change the valence of the conversation, we might send a message saying, look, you're going to hear certain rhetoric and certain statements that are more a reflection of just the political dynamics. People are running for office. So kind of compare and contrast the rhetoric, during election, season versus, afterwards. So I think that having, so there are those interpretive challenges. And I think that, from the United States, undeniably, I would say that in recent years, I think that access to certain interlocutors has diminished. I think that the United States' ability to understand what is going on in elite level Chinese politics has diminished. And the risk there is that there's a risk of misinterpretation. The less you know about your counterpart, especially when you're locked in to a very intense strategic competition, the less you are able to speak with your counterparties in confidence, the less access you have to sort of sensitive conversations. In competitive conditions, the more likely you are to impute malign motivations to your counterpart. Whereas if you were to maybe have just a candid conversation to disabuse each other, say, of misperceptions. And I think that we need, now I will say I have been encouraged that in recent months, I think particularly since the meeting between President Biden and President Xi in San Francisco this past November, we are starting to see, I think, more of a resumption of, not just more of a resumption of dialogue and high-level dialogue, but high-level dialogue that it's broaching a greater number of subjects. And I've been encouraged that we've also seen some progress recently in resuming military-to-military communications. But going back to history just for a little bit on the importance of communications and on the importance of private communications. So during the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, often described as the most dangerous 13 days in human history. So as the Cuban Missile Crisis is starting, President Kennedy's advisors come to him and say, Mr. President, you have two choices. You either acquiesce to Soviet missiles in Cuba, 90 miles away from the American homeland, or you prepare for nuclear war. And some of his advisors, and I believe Kennedy himself believed, that there was between a 1/2 and 1/3 chance of nuclear war. When his advisors presented him with those very binary stark options, President Kennedy says there has to be a third way. You can't tell me that my only options are to accept nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba or prepare for nuclear war. There's got to be a third way. And so President Kennedy took his advisors into confidence outside of the purview of the media, outside of sort of the prying eyes of the media, and he said, we need to think of a third way. We need to think of an intermediate way. And so during those perilous 13 days, President Kennedy spoke with his counterpart, Khrushchev, and he said to his counterpart, look, I realize that you have to go back to your population and say that the Soviet Union won the Cuban Missile Crisis and kind of humiliated the United States. Well, I have to do the same thing here with the American people. I have to say to the American people that the United States prevailed over the Soviet Union, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we humiliated you. They had to talk in confidence. So that essentially, so the intermediate path was, look, I know that you need a domestic political win. I need a domestic political win. And, as a bonus, we avoid nuclear war, which is a great bonus. What I worry about is now in the age of, and actually I spoke with, I've spoken with a number of folks just over the course of the past couple of days about the impact on foreign policy and the impact on just public policy more generally of the digital age. When diplomats are fearful, or not just diplomats, but even folks who are casually talking, if you are constantly fearful that someone is prying, I can't speak with you in confidence, a conversation is going to get leaked, it makes that kind of back channel diplomacy a lot harder. And so I think that we need to get back to thinking about, in the US-China context, how do we have more robust back channel diplomacy? How do we have more robust private diplomacy? And I'll just make sort of one last point, and it connects to a couple of conversations I've had today in particular. I think it's very important to connect the geopolitical and the personal. I do worry, and this is where the work of the McDonnell International Scholars Academy, where its work is so vitally important. I've just been so taken. I was really impressed when I first engaged with some of the scholars in March, when some of you visited Washington, the camaraderie between the scholars. And there are very few other programs of which I'm aware that intentionally bring students from around the world, students from different disciplines, students who presumably have different viewpoints on topics of the day, to befriend one another, to hear out each other's views. I think that forming friendships, looking somebody in the eye, that personal element really can't be overstated. You know, there was a time, even between the United States and China, and even between the United States and the Soviet Union, the diplomats came together. They had very difficult conversations, but they knew each other quite well. They would ask about each other's families. There was a little bit of a personal camaraderie that helped kind of lighten the atmosphere and that allowed for a much more conducive set of conversations. When you get to know somebody, and this is this concept that I really like, the concept of strategic empathy. It's not strategic sympathy, but strategic empathy. Strategic empathy is, do I have the capacity, and more importantly, do I have the willingness to inhabit the shoes of my counterpart? Not to say that I'm going to agree with what Guillermo has to say, but if I understand what Guillermo's perspectives are, I'm more likely to humanize him. So I think that we need to get back to a place of sitting across the table from each other, trying as best as possible to put ourselves in each other's shoes, and also through programs such as the McDonnell Academy, cultivating more cadres of students in the United States and China and elsewhere who hopefully in 10, 20 years, when they find themselves in positions of influence, if and when crises arise or tensions arise, they can call each other up and say, you know, I met you during that program. We became friends during that program. We have now a channel for calming things down.
Well, Ali, let's walk you through an exercise in strategic empathy.
All right.
You wrote a book called America's Great Power Opportunity, Revitalizing U.S. Foreign Policy to Meet the Challenges of Strategic Competition. And you're making the point, we're falling into false consensus and there be dragons, right? There's dangers lurking everywhere. Now imagine that you write a book called China's Great Power Opportunity, Revitalizing Chinese Foreign Policy to Meet the Challenges of Strategic Competition.
Oh, that's a good question. Wow.
What do I know about how inner circles, especially foreign policy circles in China, think about strategic competition with the United States? Yeah. But it seems to me, and I gather this from your narrative, right, that part of that consensus would be somewhat like as follows. We can bide our time.
Yeah.
China is a millenarian country, right? It has been around for ages. It predates foundation of the United States by a couple of millennia. Yeah. We can wait. The United States, in contrast, is a raucous, polarized place, a cesspool of political dysfunction, and it's going to collapse any given day, perhaps not on Tuesday, but soon, right? Is that consensus wrong? What would you advise in this exercise of strategic empathy?
So, I mean, your question contained a lot of the elements of the answer that I'm going to give, which is what I had started to see. So that I think the alleged consensus that exists in China, I think was actually far more pronounced a few years ago. So I remember, especially during 2020, I mean, during COVID time, when COVID was really just wreaking havoc around the world. I remember reading a number of op-eds, a number of news stories saying that historians will look back and say that COVID-19 marked the true sort of beginning of this power transition between a terminally declining United States and an inexorably resurgent China. I think that many friends and interlocutors in China, I think, subscribe to that narrative. And I often encounter this narrative that there is a consensus in China that the United States is in terminal decline. I get the sense now that there is more, that there are more very prominent, Chinese international relations scholars who are questioning that judgment. If you look at, and who are saying that perhaps we underestimated America's regenerative capacity. So if you look at the American economy, I think that the American economy of sort of OECD economies, I think the United States has had one of the best, if not the best, recovery out of OECD countries economically from COVID-19. I think a lot of folks thought sort of in early 2021 that America's diplomatic network was essentially moribund, but the United States, I think, has really done a lot to reinvigorate its diplomatic network in Europe, in the Indo-Pacific, I think in ways that have surprised, certain, Chinese counterparts. And so I think that, what I would say, so when I talk to folks in DC, I say, in a way, I would give sort of parallel advice to sort of folks in Washington and Beijing. When I talk to folks on the Hill and when I talk to folks in government in Washington, I say, don't underestimate or overestimate, China. And I think that similarly in China, I would say, really don't underestimate America's regenerative capacity. I do want to just sort of add one wrinkle on this question. Something that does worry me in the discourse, both in the United States and China, is I think it tends to veer between unhelpful extremes. In the United States, and I kind of alluded to this in my remarks, in the United States, I remember I would say between, if you had to bookend it, maybe between 1991 or so, so the end of the Cold War through the onset of the global financial crisis in let's say 2008, 2009, I think that the mistake that the United States made vis-a-vis China was one of underestimation. You know, it's the end of history. There's no way that China will become a near-peer competitor. China can't innovate in its own right. I think now we realize that that was very much a misapprehension, but there's always a risk, you know, in the world of physics, we know that, if you drop the pendulum from here, we know exactly where it's going to land when it goes in the other direction. When human-driven pendulums swing, they swing much more erratically, and so there's a risk of overcorrection. I worry now that if the mistake that the United States made before vis-a-vis China was one of underestimation, now there's one of overestimation. Is China 10 feet tall? Does China see 50 years into the future? And that kind of aggrandizement is not warranted. My favorite way of thinking about the competitive challenge from China comes from Jude Blanchett, a brilliant scholar, the Freeman Chair of China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. And he wrote a commentary in mid-2020 describing China. And he said, China isn't 10 feet tall. It's not 2 feet tall. Maybe it's 6'9". So a pretty formidable competitor, not overwhelming, but not 2 feet. On the flip side, when I talk to counterparts in China, I would say, it's a mistake to bet against the United States. The United States has, I think, a very tried and true and tested tradition of reinventing itself, regenerating itself, and I think we see, again, with its economic recovery, with the restoration, the reinvigoration of its diplomatic network, that the United States has made a lot of progress in pushing back against this notion that it's in terminal decline. What is the upshot of it? The upshot of it is that when I speak to folks in the United States, I say, look, don't underestimate China, don't overestimate it, but China is going to endure. When I talk to friends in China, I say, look, America is not going to collapse. America may not be as preeminent as it was in 1991, but it's not going anywhere. So to friends in both Washington and Beijing, the sooner that we get away from thinking about power transitions, and the more we think about, look, okay, even if it's a begrudging conclusion, I mean, I'm sure that there's some folks in the United States who say we want to win over China, and I'm sure that there's some folks in China who say we want to win over the United States. What I would like to see is, essentially a conversation in which, two sort of tired foes, after they've been sort of duking it out for, several rounds, they sit together and say, okay, I'm still standing, you're still standing. Let's talk this out. We're not going anywhere. So let's figure out how do we coexist. I think we need to have that conversation.
And that would be a great and befitting end or continuation in the sphere of foreign policy for both countries.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure hearing your views about U.S. foreign policy about China. I'm really enjoying myself immensely. I have a bunch of additional questions I could ask you. Yeah. Hopefully we'll have a chance to do that later. But I'm also mindful of the time, and I would like to give our audience the opportunity to interact with you. So without further ado, I don't know if there are any questions or concerns. Let me go over here, and then I'll pass the mic around, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Ted. I'm from Brown School, PhD in Public Sciences, second year student. My expertise is in health, so there might be some naivety in my question, but I hope you understand. So, like a couple of weeks back, I was watching this debate between John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs, especially when it comes to China, U.S. and China relationship. They seem to agree on a lot of things, but one difference they had was John being a realist in his view. He argues that, when you're like a superpower, you might need to do a lot to contend, another country or like an upcoming country like China and so on. Like that's the reality. We can think different ways, but that's the reality. And Jeffrey Sachs says, no, we don't really have to do that. We can all, go together. So when I hear your analysis, maybe, I don't know, I might be mistaken. You might be a little bit closer to Jeffrey Sachs in my opinion. But what do you think of this like as an outcome in terms of competition? Earlier, you talked a little bit about multipolar world potentially. I would say, I am from Ethiopia, so I would say there's a saying like when two elephants fight each other, it's the grass which is usually affected. But on the other side also, you've described like you can use this as a strategy if you want to do a multi-align like India So you can benefit from both. So how do you see that like for developing countries in general? But also, what is like a better way of approaching this? I know you've touched upon these ideas here and there, but if you have like your ideas.
No, Ted, thank you so much. Not only is it not a naive question, I find actually very often that, the allegedly naive questions or whatever other descriptor are often the most profound and the most important and the most neglected. So thank you for asking the question. A few thoughts. I really think, now, I can't sit up here and I cannot definitively rule out the possibility that one country, namely the United States or China, I can't definitively, because I don't have a crystal ball, none of us does, I can't rule out the possibility that historians might look back and say that in this year there was a definitive power transition between the United States and China, or that America definitively won or China definitively won. But I think that the far greater likelihood is coexistence, fraught coexistence, tense coexistence, unpredictable coexistence, but coexistence nonetheless. And there are a number of reasons for rendering that judgment. First, I think that the United States has a number of unique competitive advantages that China can't readily replicate. And on the flip side, I think that China has a number of unique competitive advantages that the United States can't readily replicate. And so it's kind of an asymmetric competition. And I think that, so that's one reason. The second reason that I think a power transition is unlikely is that because of countries such as your own, they have a voice too. And I think that one of the messages that you hear again and again and again, so I was in Aspen earlier this month, or a few months ago for the Aspen Security Forum, and Singapore's defense minister, I think he was actually the opening speaker. And of course, Singapore is, I think our Singaporean friends are some of the wisest interlocutors when it comes to navigating U.S.-China rivalry. And he made this point that, look, Singapore wants to deal with the United States. Singapore wants to deal with China. And I suspect for the vast majority of countries, that's their view as well. They're pragmatic, they're practical, they're not maybe as ideological. And again, they don't want to be the grass that gets trampled upon. And so I think that they have a much more, practical view. And I think that it's very important. And I appreciate that you in particular, coming from Ethiopia, asked this question. I think that and this is a point that I make when I talk to friends in Washington and Beijing, that yes, you need to up the tempo of dialogue with each other, but you need to get outside of the confines of bilateral thinking. Talk with counterparts in Ethiopia, in Brazil, in South Africa, in India, in Indonesia. And I think that one of the through lines that you hear is, we don't want to, we meaning countries outside of sort of the US-China lens, we don't want to participate in a new Cold War. We don't want to, because look, I used that phrase earlier, the new Cold War. And I think that the new Cold War is, there's this misnomer you often will hear that the first Cold War, it was a long peace. Well, it was a long peace at the very highest level. Thankfully, mercifully, the United States and the Soviet Union didn't go to nuclear war. But beneath that threshold, it was anything but peaceful. The Cold War was a devastating period in human history for many countries in the developing world. Think of the number of civil wars, think of the number of genocides, think of the number of proxy wars. I mean, tens of millions of people perished during the Cold War. So all a way of saying your perspective is not naive at all. And I think that we should be incorporating perspectives such as yours much more intentionally in conversations in Washington and Beijing. So I think I really just wanted to say thank you for the question.
Thank you, Ali. In the interest of time, I see a couple of people that have raised their hands, maybe three. So I'm going to ask you to be brief. And you over there, maybe? Yeah. If you raise your hand, you'll get a mic. And then Ganesh would be next.
Thank you. Really interesting discussion. I'll be brief. I'm just intrigued by your comment on the 10-foot versus 2-foot, 6.9. And
I can't claim credit for that.
Right, but I'm from the business school. A lot of discussion is not about like how intimidating the opponent is, but how damaging it will be for you to step on your own feet. So the idea is that facing opponent, China is getting increasingly nationalistic. You see a lot of policies that, go back to the planned economy era in response to the fear of competition. US is now having 100% tariff, a lot of industrial policies out of the fear of competition. So I'm just curious your comment on, the self-destruction potential I wish it remains potential self-destruction going on because of the competition between the two countries.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead and.
Oh, should we
just
take a
make-
few
Yeah,
seconds, or-
no, no.
Okay,
take-
okay, I'll just.
Yeah, I want to give a chance to others as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I really couldn't agree more. And I think that your comment, it actually reminded me, there was a wonderful piece in Project Syndicate written in 2019 by Arvind Subramanian and a co-author, I think Josh Feldman, I'm forgetting, but Arvind Subramanian and a colleague. And they said that we don't have, and they were getting to your point about sort of engaging in sort of self-destructive actions in response to a competitor. They said, we don't have a US-China G2, we have a G2 minus. And the argument that they make is that, the argument that the two made is that the United States and China, in competing with one another, they seem to be more focused on knocking each other out rather than on sort of investing in themselves. And because the United States and China are so strong, have so many sources of advantage, they can duke it out for a long time. But I think to your question, I do worry about the damage that they inflict. And just in the interest of time, and maybe we can talk more afterwards, I think one very concrete form of, I think, sort of self-damage. I'm very concerned about the atrophying of people-to-people exchanges, which is, again, a real testament to the work that the McDonnell Academy is doing. So, sitting here in the United States, we now have fewer than 1,000 American students in China. It is down from a high water mark of, I think, 15,000 American students in the 2011-2012 academic year. Call me naive, I remain of the belief that one of the most potent antidotes to strategic frictions is student-to-student exchanges. Ideally, you have students who meet each other when they're a bit on the younger side, and then when they find themselves in positions of influence 10, 20, 30 years on, they can say, oh, we did that academy together, we did that seminar together, and they can talk. So I think your question is spot on. What I would like to see, maybe I'll close here, is I think it's very important for both the United States and China, as competitive as the relationship is, the United States in theory and in practice, it should be able to articulate its domestic and international purposes without having to invoke an external competitor. And ideally, I think China would be able to articulate its domestic and international purposes affirmatively without having to invoke the United States. It's proving to be a difficult exercise, but I think it's a worthy exercise to undertake.
I think we have a chance to listen to a couple more questions. So I saw you, Ganesh, and then did you want to ask a question as well? So 3 questions.
Sure, yeah.
Let's have them all together.
Sure.
And then we'll give you the last word before we.
Hi, Ali. Thank you for the insightful talk. I'm Ganesh, a PhD candidate in environmental engineering. So China's preeminence in critical minerals, electric vehicles, and solar photovoltaics means that it plays a pivotal role in the global energy transition and meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement in terms of climate change action. But at the same time, a lot of Western industrialized nations are erecting tariff barriers to these emerging technologies. So do you see possibly a middle path that would address Chinese overcapacity, global climate action, as well as the need for Western countries to protect their industrial base?
Thank you for coming to WashU, and I'm an undergraduate in majoring in political science. My name is Drew. I feel like the one big question that have yet to be addressed is the elephant in the room, and that is the question of Taiwan. Obviously, when it comes to China foreign policy, China wants to unify with Taiwan by force if necessary, while the US sort of is leaning on the gray area of whether we should commit to Taiwan or we should stay out the question or of the issue. So, as you mentioned earlier, how can we coexist peacefully together while the issue of Taiwan remains this big red beaming flag that sort of divides both the US and China?
If it's a similar.
So I just want to state that so because you're talking about put aside the power transition and then make US and China have really good collaboration, which will have bonus for each other. But how to what do you think about in long term, what is the US government attitude towards Taiwan policy? Do you think if they're going to pursue the cooperation between China and US, are they going to still sell in the like weapon to Taiwan and then make them to can defend themselves?
Let's take one more, I believe, and then you'll have the last word. We are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, I mean, you're the. I've been heard before.
Hello, thank you, Ali. And I'm a Brown School student, social work, the first year graduate student. So my question, like you mentioned about people to people, and I do some work about like the immigration, like from illegal immigration from Mexican, from other countries to the US. I can find out from my study and also my personal experience, there are a lot of like Chinese want to immigrate to the US legally or illegally. And I also found like in Hong Kong, a lot of people cause 2019, something happened, like people moved to England, Singapore, like a lot of like Thailand people, they move out of China. And now currently they're like a lot of finance, like Shanghai people, like Shanghainese, they want transfer their site to other countries. So how do you think this kind of domestic problem compared to the US and China's relationship? Thank you.
Let's see you try to weave answers to these very
Goodness.
difficult questions.
Lightning round.
Couple, 3 minutes maybe.
Okay, lightning round. No, again, just all of these questions have been terrific. So a preemptive apology that there's going to be a discrepancy between the profundity of your questions and the impoverishment of my answers, but I'll do my best. Ganesh, I mean, your question, I mean, frankly, you would be vastly more you're vastly more knowledgeable about this tension than I am. But really, just to underscore the point that you made, I think that one of the biggest tensions, and we're seeing this tension unfold, is a number of advanced or most advanced industrial democracies simultaneously they want to de-risk more aggressively from China, but they also want to accelerate their clean energy transitions. The difficulty is which country is the linchpin of green supply chains? Overwhelmingly, it's China. And so you're squaring that tension. You want to accelerate your clean energy transition. You want to de-risk from China. You want to do them at the same time. But the country whose inputs are necessary for you to accelerate that transition is a country from which you're trying to de-risk. So it's a very, very knotty problem. You know, my sense, look, I don't think there's any sort of silver bullet or no green bullet, I should say. No really good answer. I suspect that, what countries are trying to do is some kind of muddle through in which it's a combination of, at a limited level, continuing to import green inputs from China, but also trying to create green supply chain, sort of a green supply chain ecosystem among advanced industrial democracies, trying to reshore or onshore, reshore, more green, manufacturing. It's sort of a bucket. It's like a combination of policies. But again, this is a very, very thorny dilemma. And I think that anybody who pretends that either the dilemma doesn't exist or that this dilemma is going to be resolved quickly, I think is not really, thinking about what a viable middle path will look like. Is there a middle path? I think that there is, but it's going to unfold over time. It's going to be very messy. It's going to involve difficult trade-offs. And I think that, and I should say, just before moving on to Taiwan, speaking of, difficult, questions and difficult issues, when we talk about, Ganesh, the question that you pose, is there a middle path? No matter what middle path you pick, there are going to be trade-offs. And I think I want to, stress this point. I think that in the world of policy, and I would submit, particularly when it comes to national security and foreign policy, when in the world of, or at least in the worlds in which I spend a lot of time, and I perhaps am a contributor to this problem, I like to think that there's a good solution, there's a better solution, and maybe there's an ideal solution. I think in real life, your solutions very rarely, first of all, there usually are not solutions. You're managing problems, not solving them. But whatever proposals you might articulate, they very rarely are good, better, and best. They're bad, worse, even worse, and catastrophic. And so if you find a middle path that avoids catastrophe, in my book, you get a check. But I think that you've hit on a very, very powerful dilemma and a trade-off between going greener faster and de-risking from China faster. Taiwan, obviously, Taiwan is the most potent source of friction between the United States and China. I am an irrepressible optimist. So my point of optimism on Taiwan is, look, The United States and China have managed to avoid war over Taiwan on account of what's, I guess, more formally known as dual deterrence. That's sort of the US policy, more colloquially in Washington known as strategic ambiguity. I'm sure most of you are familiar, but for those of you who maybe aren't, just the brief upshot of dual deterrence, strategic ambiguity from a US perspective is that the United States wants to be sufficiently ambiguous about what it would, if war were to break out. The United States wants China to believe the United States wants to create enough ambiguity in China's mind so that China says, well, gosh, if we go and invade Taiwan, the United States is going to respond with fire and fury, and it's going to be devastating for us. And the United States wants Taiwan to think, if we make moves towards independence, and if China invades, the United States might not come to our defense. So the idea of dual deterrence is you keep China on its toes, you keep Taiwan on its toes, and hopefully China doesn't attack and Taiwan doesn't move towards independence. That formula has worked for 45 years. If you haven't heard recently, I would recommend it, the testimony from the State Department's top diplomat for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, Daniel Crittenbrink. I think a legendary diplomat. He's worked in Republican administrations, Democratic administrations, a real crown jewel in the foreign policy community. And he testified recently, and he said, is dual deterrence a perfect policy? No, but there is no such thing as a perfect policy. But does it get a check for having preserved the peace for 45 years? Yes. And so if we can somehow, and this is going to be a very complicated juggling act, but the United States, China, and Taiwan, I think, have a very vital national interest in preserving dual deterrence. Punting, kicking the can down the road. And if you can punt the can or kick the can, whatever the right language is, and if you can do so indefinitely, it's maybe not satisfactory, but if you avoid war, I think that you get a check. For the third question, I can't say that I mean, you are far more familiar with, you mentioned, challenges of, legal immigration, illegal immigration, a bit outside of my wheelhouse. But, what I can say, just talking a little bit about the intersection between kind of the domestic dimensions, the domestic political dimensions of US-China rivalry and the geopolitical strategic dimensions, they're intimately intertwined. I think student exchanges are one good example of that intersection. Another good example is I worry very much about, I shouldn't even say potential because this potential is manifesting. I worry about the very real existence of societal spillover from intensifying competition. I was reading a survey that the Committee of 100 put out last month, surveying Chinese Americans, and they said 65%, so almost 2/3, 65% of Chinese Americans say that the poor state of bilateral relations between the United States and China negatively affects how other Americans treat them. I mean, I was shocked when I heard that statistic. So the domestic and so whether you look at student exchanges and sort of, winnowing student exchanges, whether you look at, I think, the growing fear and the anxiety that a lot of Chinese Americans have, there are a number of intersections. I'll close with, I think, one sort of intersection between domestic politics and US-China relations. Sitting here in Washington, I wouldn't presume to speak for friends in Beijing, but sitting in Washington, I remember that when this talk about great power competition and intensifying strategic competition with China, so sort of circa 2017, 2018, when this discussion really started taking off, I remember reading a number of op-eds saying, thank goodness we have a resurgent China. Now that we have a resurgent China, we have a big external competitor again. Americans will mobilize, they'll put aside their political differences and will mobilize once again. And the thought was that in the way that Americans mobilized in response to the Soviet threat, that they would respond similarly and make common cause in responding to the China challenge. And it was very interesting, actually, on the plane ride over to St. Louis from Washington. I read an op-ed by one of my favorite op-ed writers, Janan Ganesh. He writes for the Financial Times, and he wrote a kind of mea culpa op-ed. So in 2020, he wrote an op-ed saying, thank goodness for a resurgent China. It's going to bring Americans together. He wrote an op-ed a couple of days ago saying, wow, that op-ed was completely wrong. Americans aren't coming together at all. So our strategic competition with China continues to escalate, but Americans are more polarized than ever. Why do I bring up that discrepancy? One, I think in response, I was making this point earlier in response to an earlier question. I don't think that the United States should use China as a crutch. In other words, if we can't articulate our purposes at home, if we can't make progress on intractable public policy challenges at home, if we can't articulate an affirmative foreign policy vision without invoking China, then we need to really examine what we're doing. Number one. And I think that number two, we really need to ask ourselves some serious questions about the resilience of our politics, the resilience of our society, the resilience of our communities. If we say, my goodness, if the China challenge isn't bringing us together, all hope is gone for restoring civility, for restoring discourse, for restoring community. And so just to close with, one of the themes of sorts that I've tried to articulate during my time here in St. Louis is that the geopolitical and the personal, the domestic and the external, they're very intimately intertwined. And I think that a big undertaking for all of us here, and why I'll close here, why I'm so delighted to be here and why I've been so delighted to meet with so many of the McDonnell International Academy scholars is, to me, what the McDonnell Academy represents, and I think a lot of the work that WashU in St. Louis, what it appreciates is, if you want to make progress on public policy issues, if you want to make progress on mitigating strategic rivalries or easing strategic distrust, you have to bring people together. They have to listen to each other in a civil manner, meet with one another in a civil manner, debate in a civil manner. So just thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. I hope to talk with some of you afterward, but really just thank you so much for having me.
Please join me in thanking Wyne. Yes.